So, Princess and May have just pulled off one of the most quietly ruthless power moves we've seen in modern royal history. And honestly, the fact that almost nobody seemed to see it coming is probably the most fascinating part of the entire story. We're not talking about some dramatic announcement made in front of the cameras. We're not talking about a carefully planted story appearing in a newspaper that's known to be friendly with the palace. We're talking about one signature placed on a document inside a private palace office. A signature that allegedly changed who would have control over one of the late Queen's most deeply personal estates. And the reaction, according to the accounts surrounding this story, was almost immediate. Within hours, royal commentators discussing the situation claimed the phones were going non-stop. Senior court figures were suddenly finding themselves outside the inner circle. People who had spent years believing they had a permanent place at the decision-making table were apparently discovering that the table had been moved without anyone bothering to tell them. And the person who ultimately ended up holding the keys to this particular part of the royal legacy was Catherine, Princess of Wales. As for the people suddenly left on the outside looking in, well, that's where this story becomes genuinely complicated. Because this isn't really about a piece of land. It's about trust. It's about which members of the late Queen's family are believed to be capable of carrying her personal legacy into the next generation. And if the accounts are accurate, the answer to that question was enough to leave some people absolutely furious. Now, before we go any further, if you're enjoying this deep dive into royal power dynamics, make sure you hit that subscribe button and join us here at Crown Watch. We break down these stories every single music week. So let's get into what allegedly happened, because once you move past the sensational headlines, the details become much more interesting. Princess Anne has spent virtually her entire public life building a reputation around one very simple word: duty. She doesn't chase drama. She doesn't appear to enjoy palace leaks. She doesn't seem interested in participating in the whisper network that has surrounded royal life for generations. She turns up. She does the work. And then she goes home. That has been her image for decades. Which is precisely why, when she allegedly made this decision concerning one of Queen Elizabeth's private estates, the move carried a level of weight that would be difficult to create if it had come from someone known for impulsive behavior. Music. The estate itself wasn't simply another royal property sitting on a list somewhere. This was reportedly a place where Queen Elizabeth could step away from the endless machinery of the monarchy and simply breathe for a while. A place where she could temporarily leave the crown behind and exist as herself rather than as the sovereign. Every garden path, every cottage, every piece of timber in the main residence had supposedly been influenced by her personal choices. It represented privacy. It represented familiarity. It represented a part of her life that existed beyond the public spectacle of the monarchy. And for years, there had apparently been what you could describe as quiet assumptions about where control of the property would eventually go. Certain circles within the palace had reportedly operated under the belief that the estate would naturally move toward whoever held the greatest proximity to the reigning monarch. Plans were supposedly considered. Future events were imagined. Private arrangements were discussed. People had built expectations around the idea that the traditional channels of royal influence would continue functioning exactly as they always had. And then Princess Anne looked at that entire assumption and, apparently, decided the answer was, absolutely not. The instant the document was reportedly placed on that table music, and Anne pressed her signet into the sealing wax, the inheritance structure that people had quietly assumed would continue suddenly appeared to collapse. There were no elaborate preliminary meetings made public. No lengthy advisory board review. No carefully timed leak designed to gauge how the public might respond. Instead, according to the accounts surrounding the decision, and moved with remarkable precision, music, cutting through layers of palace bureaucracy and turning what could have been treated as a simple property decision into something that felt much bigger. It felt like a declaration. And the person she ultimately chose was Catherine. Not because Catherine demanded the property. Not because she supposedly shouted the loudest in the room. But because, in Anne's reported assessment, Catherine represents what comes next for the institution. That's the logic behind the decision. That's the argument being made. And when you actually lay that reasoning out, it does make a certain amount of sense. Why would you place the late Queen's most personal sanctuary in the hands of someone who represents anything other than the long-term future of the monarchy? Why wouldn't you protect it through the person expected to guide the institution into its next chapter? But this is exactly where the situation becomes complicated, because apparently not everyone viewed the decision through that same lens. Music. The reaction from circles associated with Camilla was described by royal commentators as explosive. And I want to be careful here, because much of what has been discussed appears to come from commentary, speculation, and alleged insider accounts rather than an official palace confirmation. But the picture that emerges from those accounts is one of genuine surprise, followed by anger. Music. These were reportedly people who had spent years believing that their closeness to the throne gave them a meaningful voice in decisions of this kind. They had allegedly spent months, and in some cases years, building relationships, cultivating influence, and negotiating access to private, music royal properties. They had reportedly made plans behind closed doors based on the assumption that the established system would continue to protect their position. And then Princess. And supposedly sat down, signed one document, and made those expectations irrelevant. The feeling of betrayal in that room must have been enormous. Music. You don't smash an antique teacup onto a parquet floor because everything is going perfectly, right? That image of porcelain hitting the floor, music, captures the emotional side of the story perfectly. It's the kind of reaction that happens when someone suddenly realizes the game they believed they were playing has changed completely. Music. And what makes this particularly fascinating from the outside is that the anger doesn't appear to be about the physical property itself. Let's be honest. Camilla's wider family circle isn't exactly facing financial hardship. This isn't really about acres, buildings, property values, or potential agricultural income. It's about relevance. It's about influence. And, perhaps most importantly, it's about realizing that political authority connected to one particular reign can only last as long as that reign does. Catherine's position is different. Her authority is connected to something that can't simply be negotiated away behind closed doors. She's expected to become queen. That's not merely a possibility. That's not a situation where everyone has to wait and see how events unfold. That's the anticipated future of the institution. And Princess Anne's reported decision appears to have sent a very clear message. When it comes to protecting Queen Elizabeth's personal legacy, the long-term future may matter more than the temporary power structures of the present. Now, the timeline here is extremely important, because this doesn't appear to have been some decision made overnight. According to the accounts that have circulated, Princess Anne had supposedly been thinking about these concerns for quite some time. She had allegedly noticed a growing network of private and commercial interests beginning to move closer to the estate's music boundaries. We're talking about outside figures who reportedly viewed the property less as a sanctuary and more as an asset. Something that could potentially be developed. Something that could be leveraged. Something that could eventually be divided up or commercially exploited. And Anne's calculation, if these reports are accurate, was brutally straightforward. If the estate remained connected to the constantly shifting personal influences surrounding the reigning court, eventually its original purpose could be lost. The only way to protect its meaning permanently would be to place it in the hands of someone who couldn't easily be pressured, pushed aside, or outmaneuvered. And Catherine, at least according to this version of events, checked every box. She has public support. Music. She represents generational continuity. And most importantly, she's not going anywhere. But here's where the story takes its biggest turn. Because the real twist, the detail that transforms this from ordinary palace politics into something much more extraordinary, allegedly emerged when the legal team began searching through the archives. Once the initial shock had faded and people around Camilla reportedly began discussing whether the transfer could be challenged, researchers apparently started searching for any precedent, technicality, or legal loophole that might provide grounds for an objection. And instead, they allegedly discovered something completely different. A small red leather envelope. It was reportedly sitting at the bottom of an old file box, sealed with royal wax and dated years before the current dispute had ever begun. Inside was what the accounts describe as a codicil, a legal addendum written in music, Queen Elizabeth's own handwriting. And the contents, if the story is accurate, changed the entire situation. Music. Because the late Queen had supposedly anticipated precisely this kind of conflict. She had allegedly already determined how the estate should be handled. According to the reported document, the property was intended to remain an unalterable sanctuary connected to the future of the crown, protected from claims by extended family members and temporary factions within the royal household. And suddenly, Catherine wasn't merely Anne's choice. She was supposedly Queen Elizabeth's choice as well. Documented. Sealed. Waiting for the right moment to be put into effect. Music. And that is the detail that changes the entire interpretation of the story. Because before this alleged discovery, anyone opposing the transfer could portray it as a personal power play. They could argue that Princess Anne had overstepped. They could describe the move as sudden. They could claim the decision hadn't been properly considered. But if that sealed document really existed as described, then the entire argument changes. Because suddenly, Anne wasn't creating a new plan. She was simply carrying out an old one. But the second that envelope was opened, the entire argument ings. Because suddenly, Anne wasn't creating a new plan. She was simply carrying out an old one. But the second that envelope was opened, the entire argument reportedly fell apart. Music. Because you can't stand there and claim you're protecting the late Queen's wishes when the late Queen's own words appear to contradict everything you're demanding. You can't invoke royal precedent when that precedent was apparently established by the monarch herself in a document that nobody had thought to look for. Every accusation, every objection, music. Every media narrative questioning Catherine's elevation suddenly slammed into the same immovable barrier. What was described as Queen Elizabeth's explicit final instruction. The legal framework was reportedly airtight. The decision was effectively settled. And everyone who had spent weeks furious about the transfer was suddenly forced to confront a much more uncomfortable reality. They weren't really fighting Princess Anne. They were fighting a plan that had allegedly been created years earlier by a woman who understood exactly how complicated things could become once she was no longer there to control the situation. The strategic intelligence behind Anne's reported move becomes even clearer the longer you examine it. She didn't simply move a property from one set of hands to another. She built a protective wall around it. By placing Catherine in control with this level of alleged legal protection, and effectively made it extraordinarily difficult for commercial interests, private agendas, or changing palace factions to gain access to the estate. Music. Catherine is the future queen. Her position isn't based on whether someone currently likes her. It isn't dependent on who happens to be closest to the king on any particular day. It isn't determined by which courtier has someone's ear. Her position exists beyond all of that. And Anne appears to have recognized something that only someone with decades of experience inside the institution might fully understand. If Queen Elizabeth's sanctuary was genuinely going to survive, it needed to be placed somewhere outside the reach of ordinary palace politics. Music. That isn't a childish feud. It isn't a petty act of revenge. It's long-term institutional strategy from someone who has spent practically her entire life watching how power inside the monarchy actually moves. Music. And for Catherine, the emotional weight of this is difficult to overstate. She's not reportedly celebrating. She's not standing on the balcony taking a victory lap. She's not behaving as though she has just won some enormous palace competition. Instead, the accounts describe her quietly studying the estate plans, looking over agricultural reports, conservation proposals, and the practical responsibilities attached to the property, while fully understanding that every decision she makes from this point forward will be examined by people who may already be waiting for her to make a mistake. Imagine walking those same tree-lined paths where Queen Elizabeth once went to escape the noise of royal life. Music. The responsibility must feel completely different once you know you're no longer simply visiting a historic place. You're responsible for preserving it. And that kind of burden is probably impossible to explain properly to anyone who has never lived inside that world. Music. Because this isn't really a gift. It's a trust. And Catherine appears to understand that distinction. Prince William, meanwhile, has reportedly made his own position very clear to anyone who has asked about the matter. Any attempt to undermine Catherine's appointment, or to challenge Princess Anne's authority over the decision, would music, supposedly be met with firm resistance. William saw his grandmother build this sanctuary. He knew what the place represented to her. He understood that it wasn't simply another royal asset sitting somewhere on a balance sheet. And according to this account, he has absolutely no intention of watching someone dismantle it for their own personal advantage. The message, music, coming from that side is remarkably straightforward. This is finished. This is legitimate. And this is not something that remains open for negotiation. The larger implications are arguably even more important than the property itself. Because this transfer appears to symbolize something much bigger. Music. It represents a changing of the guard. A quiet but unmistakable declaration that one era is moving toward its conclusion while another is preparing to take its place. The old networks of silent influence are beginning to weaken. The future of the monarchy belongs to William and Catherine. Music. And decisions like this make that reality increasingly difficult to ignore, postpone, or manipulate. Music, Princess Anne, by acting at the moment she allegedly did and in the manner she reportedly chose, essentially forced the institution to stop looking backward and start looking.